Hello, everyone. This is Obiora Nwazota, and this is how I create.
Welcome to This Is How We Create, a show that digs deeper into the creative life of contemporary artists of color. Discover what feeds their creativity and how they found or are finding their artistic voice. Through these intimate and candid conversations, you'll gain insights into the lives of creative professionals of color that are hard to find anywhere else. Welcome back to This Is How We Create. I'm your host, Martine Severin. I'm excited to welcome architect and design tastemaker Obiora Nwazota to the show. Obi moved to the U.S. from Nigeria to study architecture. Upon his graduation from architecture school, he went on to work at the most innovative design firms in Chicago. From there, he would found his own firm, Ona Formation, where he created several acclaimed projects influencing various scenes and cultures throughout Chicago before becoming the owner of the Orange Skin showroom and Minotti Chicago monobrand showroom. In 2020, Obi launched Okpara House, whose mission is to harness the power of good design and dialogue and academic research as powerful agents to stimulate, reactivate, elevate, and reimagine Igbo culture. Through Okpara House, he reclaims and asserts Igbo culture's relevance to contemporary lifestyles within and beyond the Igbo community. In 2021, Okpara House Publishing released their first book, Nkemdiche, Why Do We Not Grow Beards?, which is an all-ages illustrated storybook that is simply fantastic. You have to check it out. During our conversation with Obi, we will discuss how he came to architecture and design and how growing up Igbo influences and influenced everything he does. We talk about what culture means and what it means to be of African descent in these modern times, and how to think about imbuing rituals in our everyday routines. We close the discussion with the story of how he came to write his book, Nkemdiche, Why Do We Not Grow Beards? All right, let's go ahead and start the show. Enjoy. Welcome, Obi.
Oh, thank you so much, Martine.
So I know I called you Obi, but your name is Obiora, as everyone heard from the beginning of the show. But you've called yourself Obi for short. Before the show started, we talked about how important names are. And you are originally from Nigeria. Can you talk to us about what it was like for you being little Obiora growing up in Nigeria?
Sure. I was pretty shy, timid, perhaps, but mostly I would say because I was ahead of my class, and so I was always with older kids. As boys, girls mature much faster than boys, and so I would imagine that for me, being too young for my classmates was responsible for the way I tended to be. Maybe I don't want to use the word an introvert, but like I was more a dreamer, where I could disappear in my little head and then allowed my moods to let me travel.
So with your moods helping you to travel, how did those moods and your mind end up traveling to an interest in architecture and design?
Well, for me, play was such an escape. I was very much into building. Every little boy would get toys, whether it was Legos and things like that. You were always creating, these other worlds. And so I've always been fascinated by storytelling, not the physical world we lived in, but these other fairy tales, by otherworldly adventures and things like that, because it allowed me to, I always believed it was a place where rules were so fluid and you could create and, create alternatives that were real in my head, as opposed to what the adults, what the strict conventions of real world imposed, especially on a child. So for me, I think ending up being creative was not wasn't a surprise for me, I should say. Yeah, that's not a surprise that I ended up that way.
Specifically, where are you from in Nigeria?
I'm actually Igbo. Yes, I grew up in the southeastern part of Nigeria, which actually has a huge link to Haiti, by the way.
Well, I would just say Igbo Lele.
There you go.
Yes, we have Vodou is very much linked to our African roots, and who's to say that my ancestors aren't Igbo?
No. Well, your first rulers, I shouldn't say rulers, but the first Toussaint or whatever, I can't remember his name, in Haiti, he's actually of Igbo ancestry.
Aha.
The original revolution, or the first black president of...
Toussaint Louverture.
Yes, him. Yeah. So you actually do have a very strong direct Igbo representation in Haiti. And matter of fact, in the Biafran War, we tried to see it from Nigeria in 1968, between 68 and 70. And the first country to recognize the Igbos was actually Haiti.
The Igbo culture is basically the tapestry, in my opinion, of Haitian culture. I think it influences our music, it influences our art, and I reckon it influences the food that we eat. When you think back about that young boy, can you tell me a little bit about what he would think about where you are now in your life?
I think, in an interesting way, I'm sure he'll be impressed. But at the same time, I think to go from where I was far away in those little towns and townships in Igbo land, to me here in Chicago and doing what we're doing and influencing culture, design, and people's lives, I don't think it's something that would have been dreamt, of. Perhaps, maybe traditionally growing up, England was the go-to place of my parents' time and the time before. So America was never really in the radar. So it was never something that was even thought about. Matter of fact, my dad would always think that this place was just a place, filled with cowboys and unruly people and all whatnot, But then again, that's just how story goes around the world. I remember when I first came here, one of my classmates from Peru, when her family learned that she had gotten a scholarship to come to America, they were so excited until they found out that it was in Chicago, and they all freaked out, because they all thought Al Capone was still running around. Yes. Long time ago, America was not even part of the radar. But at the end, I think what would have been impressive for young Obi is that I broke away from the normality and the expectations of most of the children I grew up with, where everybody had to be, you're either a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're an engineer, and all these very strict formats of education. And, the arts was not something that was encouraged. A matter of fact, that's part of why I daydreamed a lot as a kid, because those are the things that were easily taken away from you, because I wanted to put structure, and people didn't know how to deal with a kid that wants a career in creativity. It just wasn't safe. And I think it's something that continues even till today. Although today it's a bit more relaxed, people are a bit more appreciative of creative industries. But back then, it just wasn't. And so at first, as a child, it was tolerated. But then at some point, you have to now grow up and start taking, serious your studies, and you're going to go become an engineer or this and that and blah, blah, blah. My mind wasn't having any of that. And so I think young Obi seeing me today will be like, wow, you really did it.
I'm curious as to how you did it. How were you able to convince your father, who probably, as you mentioned, that everyone was going to England, but you ended up coming to Chicago. How did you manage to convince them to allow you to go across to where Al Capone probably still reigned?
Well, I'll tell you something. I grew up in a strict home. I mean, it wasn't fun. It was not fun at all. I mean, this is how not fun it was. Most of my mates in boarding school hated going to any excuse. I mean, boarding school was fun, but any excuse to go home, they were on it. For me, boarding school was my escape. Time to go home after boarding school was dread. I dreaded it. By the time I could, this was my means of running away, because so it worked out that my father never liked America, rarely came this way. And so I was like, where is the farthest place I can go that these guys would not come after me and then I can go be myself? And America happened to be it. And the moment it was possible, I was gone. And so coming here meant that I now could take control of my life and do and really push myself to where I wanted to go without, having to submit to higher forces, and so forth and so forth. And I mean, there's so much more to it than this interview allows. But anyway, that's the general gist of it.
I think you're right. I don't think we have the time to speak about this part about you having an intrinsic understanding of who you are and how restrictive you might have felt. I'm putting words in your mouth, yeah. But, or not fun. You said not fun. How not fun.
Yeah, but you have to be correct. Even when you say not very restrictive, actually, believe me, that's mild. I'm not saying that. I mean, I'm not talking about being abused. That's not the point. It's not, I wasn't abused or any other stuff, but it's just people. And remember I said at the beginning how like I went to school far too young for my proper age mates. The difference between a 9-year-old boy and a 12-year-old boy is like night and day, as opposed to a 21-year-old boy and a 24-year-old person. You understand? The age is such a big difference. People are expecting of you what someone at 12 is doing, and you are 9. And, it's just, Anyway, restrictions were also based on their expectations that were just not correct.
Thank you for sharing that. There's a huge difference psychologically and developmentally between 9 and 12, I know for sure. So you came to Chicago to study architecture. Can you tell me a little bit about how, what that experience was like and how your approach to architecture and design has changed since you've been over here?
So I came here, I came to study architecture. My first semester, I didn't know my left from my right, because actually, in fact, I transferred into my second year. So I actually missed out on the first year, when people have been broken in and you're being taught the basics and all that stuff. And so I joined them in my second year without any of that stuff. And I'm sure most of my classmates thought I might not even survive the next semester, which truly was about to happen. Somehow I discovered that there was more to architecture than architecture. And that was the world of design. And that's what I became smitten by. I remember approaching one of my professors and I'm like, oh man, please, could you teach me how to design? And the guy looks at me and laughed. And it's like, Obi, if I could teach you how to design, I won't be here talking to you. I'll be in my own private island, richer than God, And I was like, oh my goodness. But then he actually gave me some pointers. I ended up basically living in a library, soaking up everything that was to do about design and all that stuff. So I literally taught myself to recognize and to understand what were the markers, what were the differences, what was what. Of course, at first, your copy and, it's a copy and paste type of a thing. And then slowly, things start to align, they start to make sense, and you start to discern these things. And so for me, that was the beginning of realizing that there was more to architecture than the discourse allows, where you're almost kind of boxed in, within certain strict rules and things like that. And for me, anything that gives me the feeling of being strict, automatically I want to break out of that. And that, I think, goes back to my childhood. And so from the get-go, the way I saw architecture was not necessarily the way a lot of my classmates did, where it's about brick and mortar, it's about philosophy and blah, 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 and all that stuff. For me, it was about living, how we lived, and architecture I saw in everything. And so it took a long time to get to where I am today in terms of being in a position to manifest these things. Because to me, the training of architecture, you go to school and you train for 4 years, 5 years, 7 years. It's not enough because architecture, for me, it's a combination of art and science. And it's probably one of the ultimate forms of creativity. And you can't, there's nothing any school can teach you in 5 to 7 years, That's why I think even in our trade, even when you practice architecture as a formal endeavor, it takes years and years and years and years for you to start to break out, to start to really do stuff. I quickly found out that for me, it wasn't just in building actual buildings, but architecture for me was it was beyond building, be it in books, be it in products, objects, art, food, you name it. That to me, it's architecture of life. And that was what my interest became.
I fell in love with design, everything that has to do with design when I was in my early 20s. How I grew up around a lot of immigrants where we were told you had to go into the sensible careers, lawyer, or medicine.
Yep.
Design never occurred to me. And it's not until now that I realized that world, and the world I am now in as a photographer, that's my world. That's my jam. And I don't think I never realized that how it undergirds everything that we do. When you think about design and you see a street sign or you're going down the highway, it provides the structure to our lives. And we don't talk about that part of it.
Really, it's such a good point you're making, because to me, at the end of the day, you could be, a chemist, you could be a physician, you could be a lawyer or any of these other professions. What separates you from everybody else is actually, if you understand that every field is actually a creative field. You see, you could be a doctor and you're all about, getting that amazing salary and then, doing your shifts here, there, or you're like, how do I use the tools that I've been taught to now expand, the minds of people to create new medicines, new ways of healing and all that. So that to me is where design comes in. And you see that it's manifesting all these other things, but we tend to separate these things and partition them into different boxes. In my opinion, nature does not work that way. It's all interrelated. And so you find out that design as a course, as a discourse, actually should be an underlay on top of which all the other things should be built. And if we had that, then I believe we should be a bit more closer to understanding the way nature actually, or the natural world actually works.
And when you do look at how the world works and you think about the design that's in a leaf or the design that's on the scales of a fish, I mean, it's in everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I mean, that's another conversation that we could go into gladly. This is a really great segue because I met you before. I don't think you remember me. I was at Minotti. So you are a tastemaker and everyone in Chicago knows your name because you're not only the owner of the Orange Skin showroom and Minotti Chicago, you've even launched a restaurant. So I met you when I was doing a photo shoot with Patrick Chauvez.
Yes. Remember you were styling or no, you did the photography or something. I can't remember exactly, but yes. I remember. Oh my God.
Isn't that funny?
World. Could you imagine? Isn't that a small world?
And I remember you talking about Orange Skin and how passionate you were about design and about giving a voice to brown voices. I think you since then went and you founded Okpara House.
Correct.
Where you are creating content where the whole goal is to encourage people to take responsibility to build a better and fairer society where inclusion and equity is for everyone.
Absolutely.
And it's not just a privilege.
Yes.
I would love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, do you have a week? Okay. All right. Well, since we don't, we'll find a way to keep it very short. Well, essentially, it's this. We are, the West, pretty much deservedly or undeservedly or whatever, however you want to argue the case. That's really besides the point. But at the end of the day, they are the overarching narrative that has actually pretty much condensed every other conversation into their narrative. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The world is a multi-racial, multi-ethnic experience. Each of these ethnicities and races and, and every other thing in between is actually the richness that we are as humans. Access to all these opinions, tastes, philosophy, ideas is part of what really makes us complete. And so you find out that the entire education that runs the world of design and pretty much every other, most other professions are all seen through a singular perspective. And it's all wonderful as long as, yes, you're doing that and you're working within it and not outside of it. But then you wake up one day and you realize that there's more to this thing. There's so much more to it than just this tiny sliver of reference. And so you start to ask the questions. And, for me, the questions I started asking some years ago, what's so difficult is you can't just go off on a limb and be an army of one. I mean, some people do that, but it just puts the challenges at a spectacularly humongous place that sometimes you end up being swallowed by the challenges that you don't end up getting anything done. But anyway, so here I am. I've been under the tutelage of a particular point of reference, and I've worked within the confines of that reference point. And then you wake up one day and you realize that you come from elsewhere. And so it becomes a question of recognizing that there are other identities. And so the question becomes, and who am I? Where do I come from? What do I represent? And where am I going? You start to realize that everything you've been prepared to be has been defined by the other and has nothing to do actually with whom you are. You can continue or you could do something about it. And so I chose to actually address these things. Now, and I'm going to kind of jump in about a bit. So along my exploration, research and all whatnot, we woke up one day last year, it was 2020, and the pandemic came and then followed swiftly by the BLM movement. And so the BLM movement was so powerful and important in the sense that it tore off any blinders that we had about the concerns of Black folks worldwide. Questions were made to confront questions that we either sidestepped or didn't even recognize was there, and we just had to face on. And part of the things that I found so amazing was, at the same time, it can be shocking, but it also depends on how you look at it. They say the glass is either half full or half empty. But in my perspective, what this thing did was it took this, it violently tore off this veil on lives of Black folks to reveal a void, this empty abyss where it should have been full of, of our assets, our knowledge assets, our cultural assets, the things that are identifiers to what it is to be African. Whether you're pegged to the mainland or you're pegged to the diaspora, I mean, Black African. And so this emptiness, actually, as frightening as it is to see this void, it also was amazing to know that, but Now at least we know that this was something that should have been filled with something. That thing it should be filled with these are our assets, the contents of our life. And these things have to be built or rebuilt in this case, but rebuilding not by others, but this time around by us. And hence part of, what Okpara House stands to do is to now create. But this time around, I'm going back into my culture, Igbo culture, and taking, our assets, our knowledge assets, our cultural assets, and making them relevant again to contemporary lifestyles. And so a Black child does not wake up and not have, I don't want to use the word options, but I guess that's the closest thing I can use. But in terms of, there's nothing wrong with reading Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Nothing wrong with reading Alice in Wonderland, but you should read about you first. And then the Alice in Wonderland becomes an extracurricular thing that enriches what you already are. But right as of today, it's unfortunately, you're reading all this other stuff that has nothing to do with our heritage or anything. And then the rest that has to do with us is missing. In recognizing that, the question becomes, who gets to do these things and who are the people that are going to be working on this stuff? And this is, to me, where creatives have to wake up. Creatives of color, people of all these beautiful creatives that are people of color. It's a mandate for us to now devote this gifts that we have into cultivating, into nurturing, into creating all this content that can give our future alternatives, to give them, so if you come to the table of books, you have 10 choices. Today, you only have one choice.
I'll tell you a really short story. My son is mixed race. We were living in London at the time, and we were on holiday in Spain. And my husband is a native Spanish speaker. And we wanted to have books where, in English, books that were in French, because I speak to him in French only, and my husband speaks to him in Spanish only. So you can imagine the books that you need to have to be able to nurture all of those languages. So we go to this little bookstore in San Sebastian, and it's a beautiful bookstore that has this impressive children's section. And there are these great books that are in Spanish. And so we sat on this poof with him, and I picked a book at random. The book was called Mama and Me in Spanish. And I flipped through it. And of course, it was of this young boy and his mom. We purchased the book, but it was this of a young white boy and his white mother. As soon as we got it home, I found a brown marker and I had to literally color the mom in because I wanted to be sure that he would have a good reference. That while he's like, a cafe au lait child, I wanted him to always remember that his mom was a darker lady, more coffee colored lady. In some ways, I really wish, that little boy had your new book, which we'll talk about in a little bit, where he could see such strong representations of his culture, of his African heritage, where his people, his mom, he knows that I'm from Haiti and we have books on Haiti. He eats the food. But that other part is the passing of the culture and filling that void you talked about, because it's a psychic void, right? It's not, you can't explain it, but you do feel it. You feel that there's an absence of something. Finding literature, finding design, finding stories to fill that void is so important, and to reaffirm the right of belonging and to cultivate and to nurture, as you mentioned.
And can I expand on this a bit? Okay. Beautiful story. And so now I'm going to tell you a small thing that also is part of, there's so many things that are part of the inspiration of why Okpara House was created. But one of them was also, one day, I was thinking, man, say I wasn't home and someone came into my home. How would they know an Igbo man lives in that apartment. A black man, an African man, an Igbo man lives in that apartment. And so I asked this to people, and people were, well, I mean, they'll see, maybe the art on my wall, maybe, the food in my fridge. You start to look, and then you pick out those things. And so I'm like, yeah, that's amazing, until you realize that Black art is actually more owned by non-Black people, more or less more owned by the West than it's owned by Africans. Does that make those people Black? Or, you look into the fridge, you can eat sushi all you want, doesn't make you Japanese unless you're there. So you start to realize that once upon a time, the African was free spiritually and materially. And today we've been, I don't want to use the word robbed, but we've been cleansed systematically and methodically of everything except for the skin on our bodies. And so you find out that the rituals that define us, those things have to come back. So it's not so much about the food you eat, but how you ritualize that food. The objects around you. You wake up in the morning. What are the first things you do? How do you connect to your ancestors? When you take a bath, how do you bathe? It's not the food you eat, but how you eat it. How do you commune? Those things are all the things that, so when you look to the Japanese and you start to see how they have this ability to combine the ancient, cultures with the super, super modern culture. It's not so much about the food that you have, but how you ritualize the food. You wake up in the morning. How do you connect to your ancestors? You go to take a bath. With what are you taking a bath? And how do you even take a bath? Your ability to make and to connect spiritually to the world. So you're just this thing that exists at the behest and mercy of everybody else, And to me, that is part of what needs rebuilding as Africans. Our architecture, the way we interact with space is different from the way the West interacts with space. The West is more, it's obviously through geography, we've all been shaped. As Africans, we are more extroverts. Here, you're more of an introvert. You're more reserved in the way that you actually interact with life, And so you find out that, we are here almost like a round peg being forced into a square hole. And so for me, it's a fantastic thing to awaken to, but it's also a very terrifying thing. In terms of, oh my goodness, everywhere I look, I need to redefine what it is that defines who I am. Because it's not just a person, but the things you surround yourself by and how you interact with it.
And I'm assuming that is one of the impetus, that's one of the driving factors as to why you decided to write a book.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Well, okay, regarding the book, it's all, what's at stake is the image of the African. Our image has been defined by others that are not us. In other words, your image had already traveled ahead of you to China, to Portugal, to France, later on to the United States before we came. By the time you arrive, someone already has this idea of how they see you based on someone else's description of you. And most of it is derogatory. This has continued up until today, where the normalization of the Black image, or what it is that is the Black image, is still being defined. It's still being a subject of who gets to own it and who gets to define what that is. And yet, we're not part of that conversation, and we have to be part of that conversation. And so, for me as an African, simple things like, do you see the world, the intimate side of our existence. In other words, the interiors of how we live and how we lived in the time before the contact with the West. They're very, 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 very rare images of this. However, there are images of us from afar where you're going to see the mud huts, the scantily dressed people pounding our way out mortars, and then, the token little African, animal to identify that you're in Africa. Maybe there's a giraffe or maybe there's a lion, and then there's a certain sun, and then voila, that's the image of the African. But then there's this other side, which when the ethnographers came and the archaeologists and all this also came and carted away a lot of our objects, a lot of the things that we live with, and deposited them into Western museums, exotified them, and did something I find to be so incredibly dangerous and damaging to us, is that it turned those tools from everyday objects that are approachable, that we can use and use as part of our lives, into things to be made into exotic affairs, deposited behind glass walls on pedestals, never to be touched, never functional. What they did now do for us is that it took away your tools and then replaced it with someone else's tool. Usually the person that took away your tools replaced your tools with their tools, because obviously it's better for you to buy theirs than to continue to make yours. And so you wake up with a whole generation of people that have never interacted with anything that is made in Africa, that is part of their modern ways of living. Matter of fact, go into any African home today, it will be incredibly difficult for you to find anything that they're using that they uphold at a high level, that is a tool as part of something that is part of their ancestry. It's not our spoons and knives. It's not our bowls. It's not our chairs. It's not our tables, and all this have been exchanged for something from the other. And then you have to come to London to go to the London Museum, or you come to New York, come to Chicago to go to a museum to see how your ancestors created and made the things that actually was used in defining who you are today. It's incredible.
So I wanted to bring us back to your book, and I may not pronounce it the right way, but I encourage you to correct me.
It is called Nkemdiche.
Nkemdiche, Why Do We Not Grow Beards? This book is so beautiful. So beautiful. In fact, that I believe you won an award for it. You won an award from the American Institute of Graphic Arts because it's just that beautiful. But let's talk about the genesis of the book, how it came about. And if you could just tell us a little bit about it too, that would be great.
Well, the book started its journey probably about 3 years ago. Actually, about the time I wanted to do something to highlight where I came from. And so the first excursion I did was in food. And I had done this restaurant, showcasing Nigerian cuisine, but particularly from Igbo culture. But it was in the experience of that restaurant that I realized that, oh my goodness, I'm operating a bit farther away from where I should be. And we have issues that are much more foundational, where if the foundations are broken, you can't, it doesn't matter how amazing a structure or building you're going to build on top, it's vulnerable. To address those issues meant, unfortunately, I had to shut down the restaurant, but then shutting it down was also what then created explorations that became Okpara House. So as part of addressing foundational issues, I was interested in where our children getting their basic ideas about whom they are. And you start to look and you don't see. Or if you see, they're poorly done, and they're done because people are frustrated about what they don't have, and so they just go out and do things. Like, well, wait a minute, here I am. I come from, I'm a creative. I'm connected to some of the most amazing talents. How come we're not using these abilities to actually elevate all these amazing cultural content and treasures? And so the idea was born, to start to investigate all those things. And so when I started, there were so many directions I found myself all of a sudden, having to address. The book came about because I grew up with a rich, history of folklores. And, most people in my generation and before, that was normal. And I was like, okay, where are all the stories? You come here, you see Disney and maybe a few characters that have become this thing that Disney has become. And yet I'm like, oh my God, but where I come from, there's thousands of these things, and nothing has been done to invest into these things and take them to, polish them, modernize them, or bring them, to be part of our current, culture, either from a position of education or a position of maintaining and nurturing these assets that go back generations. And so I first started writing several. In fact, I think there are like 4 or 5. There are like 5 books or 5 storybooks that are already written. And then, but the second thing was, it wasn't good enough to rewrite some of these folklores into modern context. But the image of the African kept nagging at me. And so I wanted to also have this visual narrative that correctly addresses and portrays us for whom we are. And so this was an opportunity to actually marry both things. So at the beginning, because of the specific idea of this story in this particular book called Nkemdiche, Why We Do Not Grow Beards. Well, why we do not grow beards? At first it was why women don't grow beards, but then I changed it to why we do not grow beards so that you should also, I didn't want to just give it away so easily. But it also brought me to face a very, very difficult thing I should say, a very challenging position of perception. And so beards in the West is a thing of masculinity. It's a thing of brute force and all whatnot. It's not usually associated with feminine qualities and beauty and things like that. And that also reminded me of, a particular time way back at the onset of the century, when Picasso had come across an African mask, and it completely shattered his perception on emotions, where this mask was able to portray emotions that are deep, especially coming from someone like Picasso, trained as a portrait artist. I think he was one of the best, in the Victorian language back then in Paris. The going way of his training was more about realism, creating the most beautiful facsimile of an actual person. But that meant that was very surface. And so when he confronted this African mask, for the first time, he understood that you could actually go deeper to emotions. And so that's something we Africans are capable of. And that's something that is so normal for us. In doing this book, the question was, how can you illustrate a bearded woman and make that acceptable in the West? And so I toyed with it for a very, very long time because I couldn't figure out how I could do this until one day, you're like, wait a minute. If women grew beards, what would they do? They would do exactly what they do with the hair on their heads. They will braid it. They will fro it. They will have ribbons. They will adorn it. All kinds of things, perfumes, you name it, it'll all be there. And I was like, oh my God, that's exactly the answer. Anyway, much, much later, I now had to find someone that could work with to capture this stuff. And this young girl, Lucy, she's a French paper cut artist, very, very talented. At first, I had brought her in to do work on something else, on some paper masks that I was also exploring. And then later, I was able to convince her to come this way and do these drawings. But it took over 1.5 years of research and all kinds of stuff to get what we wanted, to get the feeling right, and she did a fantastic job at the end to really channel and get these things. Now, why is this important for me in terms of the illustration, the visual narrative? Again, like I keep saying, it's all about our control on what it is that we are and who gets to control it. You find out that the book is set in a time that coincided with the West's first interaction with Black Africa. And if you look at the images that came out of that period, it is one of savages, it's one of people that are subhuman and derogatory and all kinds of funninesses. But the same time period, in the hands of an African, you start to see our nobility. You start to, instead of seeing our existence from afar, which is mostly exterior, the huts and all that stuff, you get to see us more intimately. You see the way we are, the way, the objects of our lives and things like that. And it's such a contrast. It's such an important book in terms of not just for Black folks or Black children, but also for non-Black children to also see a better way or the right way to see this culture. So for me, the book it's so important on two sides, both as, for the community, but for outside of the community, because we want to redefine and control how we are perceived.
Just flipping through the book is such a treat because it feels like such a classic. And I would recommend that people listening to this will definitely have the link to both how to purchase the book and to Okpara House. It's incredibly beautiful, and I really want to commend you for adding to the literature and adding to the history and finding a way to nurture, to encourage people to be more inquisitive and to encourage just love. Because I think that in the Western world, it seems that only a book like Alice in Wonderland, as you mentioned earlier, or any of the other books written by Westerns can be relatable. But this book is just such a treat in every way. And the typeface as well.
Yeah, no, I had an amazing team. I mean, the guys are span. I mean, oh gosh, even the printers in Latvia, everybody. It wasn't a one-man job. It was a culmination of so many different people. In fact, even before the book even came about, I'd have a few people here and there like, oh man, could you read a little bit of this and tell me what you're thinking? And we'll throw things, and they didn't even know why they were doing it, but they were, they didn't know what that meant for me. It's a book that could have only happened based on the experience I've gone through and the kinds of people I've met doing it is why this is able to happen. And I think it's kind of cool actually for me to see.
Obi, it's been a pleasure to chat with you. I really commend you in being such a light.
Thank you so much, Martin. You're just a bundle of beauty, and it's just so cool to see and to reconnect.
Hi there. I have a quick favor to ask you before you go. If you're loving the show, would you mind taking a quick second to leave us a 5-star review on your favorite go-to podcast app? Here's the thing. Those reviews are like magic fairy dust. They help other creatives of color discover our show and tap into their own artistic superpowers. While you're at it, why not subscribe to our Substack newsletter, Creative Matters? Creative Matters is like a weekly dose of inspiration delivered straight to your inbox. You can find the link to subscribe in the show notes. All right, that's all that I have for you today. I can't wait to see you on the next episode. Bye.